time, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to the No War Against Venezuela IEC-sponsored event this evening with our special guests, José Luis Granados from Venezuelanalysis and Mónica Mancera, who's a professor at Unierte and also works with Herencia. She can talk a little bit more about that if she'd like as well. Perfect. Okay. Perfect. Thank you very much, Joel. Okay, so we'll go ahead and advance slide. Now, if you would like to listen to this in Spanish, ¿Cómo escuchar en español? Busque el icono de traducción. Busque el icono interpretación o interpretación de idiomas. A menudo tiene el aspecto de un globo terráqueo en la parte inferior de la ventana de Zoom. Seleccione su canal. Haga clic en el icono y elija el canal Spanish. Opcional. Silenciar el audio original para escuchar solo el o la traductor o traductora. Puede optar por silenciar el audio original de la reunión. Si sigues teniendo problemas, envía un mensaje a TEC número 1 o 2 o 3 o 4 y ellos o ellas se ayudarán. You can advance to the next slide. If you can, probably the right button, well, if you don't mind. Oh. Wonderful. Sorry, I see that someone doesn't see this. Oh yeah. Okay, 1 second. Are people able to see this slide? My tech assistants.
I see it, but it's very small.
Okay, so let's see. That's okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and share it on my screen, and then it should be the correct size. 1 second. Okay. Thank you very much. 1 second. Okay. Can people see this okay? Wonderful. How to listen in English. Locate the interpretation icon during the meeting, find the interpretation or the language interpretation icon, which looks like a globe at the bottom of the Zoom window. Select your channel. So you'll click the icon. You'll choose the language channel you want to listen to from the list. And you can mute original audio. So that's optional to hear only the interpreter. You can choose to mute the original audio of the meeting. And if you have any issue, you can send a message to anybody with tech, then numbers 1 through 4 and their Zoom name, and they will help you. We're going to go over for a second the agenda. So I'm going to be doing some plugs for the Venezuela Working Group, and then the Venezuela work we're doing here in IC Americas and the IC more broadly, and how you can get connected into this work. Then we're going to hear from José Luis Granados Ceja from Venezuelanalysis, who's going to talk about some of the context for the looming war and the aggression we've been seeing. Then we'll hear from Mónica Mancera from Herencia, as well as Uniarte, who lives in Caracas and is going to tell us a bit about what things are like right now in Venezuela. After that, we'll hear from Lorna and Edwin from the Puerto Rico Working Group, who are going to be talking about how this push towards war has remilitarized Puerto Rico, and some of the local pushback against that militarization, and then the history of that militarization of Puerto Rico. And then we'll have time for a Q&A. So that is our agenda for the evening. Without further ado, we'll go ahead and move into José Luis's part. And so I will stop sharing my screen and we can go to him.
Hello, good evening, everybody. It's good to connect with you, especially with the IC here at DSA. We've worked together on many, many different occasions, and it's always a privilege to work with you. I'm really grateful that there is a lot of work around Venezuela happening right now amongst these forces here in the United States. We actually had the privilege of meeting in person, some of us here. Tristan, good to see you again. I see David is here, Joel. If I missed anybody, my apologies. Again, thank you so much for the invitation. Y una disculpa a todos ustedes que tal vez me estaban esperando hablar en español, pero pues aquí me dicen que todos están hablando sobre todo en inglés, así que me voy a dirigir a ustedes en inglés, pero pues como han mencionado, está la interpretación. Y un abrazo a todos mis compañeros latinoamericanos y los hispanohablantes. Okay, so I think the best place to start right now would be to talk about the situation. So I know many of us are probably familiar with what's going on, but let's do a really quick recap. Starting in September, what we saw was what I call yet another manifestation of regime change efforts in Venezuela and the broader attacks against Latin America more generally. These attacks, I think from the very beginning, at least our reading over at Venezuelanalysis, was that this was nothing about drug interdiction. It wasn't about stopping drug smuggling. It wasn't about the claims that they're putting out there about the motivations behind these attacks. They are very much about putting pressure on Maduro, on the Venezuelan government. And I think if we look to the more recent history of the cooperation between Trump, but also that we saw with Biden and Obama before Trump won, has always been kind of a reliance on the Venezuelan opposition, and namely a very specific part of the Venezuelan opposition, the hardline sector that is very much interested in ousting the Maduro government from power by any means necessary. And we've obviously gone through different manifestations of that. We saw the insurrectionary strategy in 2014 and 2017. We've seen them obviously not recognize election results. Obviously, the Juan Guaido debacle circus, I call it, where they tried to pretend that somebody else was the president, and obviously the fallout from all of that. And if I mention that because I think it's important to talk about that, because if it wasn't for that, we probably wouldn't have seen the rise of Maria Corina Machado into this kind of more prominent political place. And I think what that is very much attributable to what the whole disaster around the Juan Guaido circus. Basically, their failure to really kind of transform all of their actions in support of this hardline opposition really kind of created a vacuum. You know, the forces that are sympathetic to the opposition in Venezuela started to kind of regroup around support for Maria Corina Machado, and that's where you see her profile grow sort of in an extraordinary way. So again, to the recap, in September, we see these attacks. We see the U.S. government clearly engaging in, once again, in a regime change effort. And the thing that we wanted to warn about, I think, mostly is also that this isn't just a war on Venezuela. It's not just a war on Colombia. It's not an escalation against, you know, the Andean countries. It's a war in all of Latin America. This is a very much responding to the geopolitical moment that the United States is traversing in this moment. So why do I say that? Okay. When we think about global hegemony, we understand that the United States, for basically since the fall of the Berlin Wall, was kind of put forward as you know, the single hegemon, the single superpower, this kind of ambition to spread neoliberal capitalism throughout the entire globe. And you know, obviously we're talking about the 80s and the 90s in this period. And I think if we think about the global situation today in 2025, it would be safe to assume that the fight for global hegemony and the way that policymakers in the United States had envisioned it has been lost. You know, there is almost a de facto acknowledgement that there is now a rival to the United States, which is of course China, and that makes them adjust their strategy. And so my hypothesis is that the United States is engaging in what we could call a strategic retreat, a retreat back to the traditional spheres of influence. That's why we see a renewed interest in Latin America. That's why we saw Marco Rubio appointed to Secretary of State. That's why also we saw Christopher Landau also appointed as Deputy Secretary of State. It's very interesting. I always mention this. He actually gave a speech where he mentioned that he actually asked Rubio, he was like, why are you tapping me since I'm a guy from the Americas? And you are also somebody who's very familiar with the Americas. And he said that the response from Rubio to Landau in that moment was, well, that's precisely it. I don't want to be so distracted with other global affairs that we leave Latin America kind of forgotten about in the way that it has in a lot of moments in history of the United States, which actually I think for progressive forces was a positive thing. They were so distracted in the Middle East with the Iraq invasion and the fallout from that, that there was a room for progressive and leftist movements in the region to be able to grow. And so because we see this situation where the strategic retreat, where I think we have to understand that this isn't necessarily about kind of them giving up the fight for global hegemony. It's about, again, as the term goes, strategically trying to rebuild their forces in order to, in a future moment, dispute that hegemony. And so that means that they're going to try to, in these traditional spheres of influence, I think it's safe to say that Western Europe is largely already totally on board with the US domination project, but in Latin America, it's obviously a dispute. And so that means that it has to be done precisely in the ways that we're witnessing now, which is incredibly aggressive positions, illegal acts. We have to underline that as many times as necessary, that what's happening is a result of, it should be correctly classified as extrajudicial executions. And it's not just me saying that, it's not Venezuelanalysis, but 3 UN experts, as well as the High Commissioner for Human Rights, have labeled them as such and actually called for them to stop. So I know we can have strong opinions about international law. I think in particular, following the genocide against the Palestinian people carried out by Israel with the support of the United States, has largely weakened it. And I think its authority is very much in question at the global stage right now. But nonetheless, I think emphasizing this, I think, is really important, that these are violations of international law, international humanitarian law, violation of human rights, of the conventions that even the United States themselves are party to. Obviously, that is not going to stop this current White House from doing what they're doing, but it can help us in terms of sort of the rhetorical, the debates that we might be having around this issue. So again, I wanted to emphasize that sort of the history in terms of why I think what's happening here. Another part that I think is important is, of course, and probably people in this room can speak better to this, is the domestic considerations that I think are at play there. I talked about Rubio, I talked about Christopher Landau, but of course people like Pete Hegseth, right? You know, these are actors who, in the case of Hegseth, for example, have somewhat of reduced legitimacy. And this whole bombing scenario allows him in particular to feel like he has more authority, that he has a place, that he's jockeying for influence and power within the Trump cabinet. This gives him an opportunity to play that. And also, of course, Rubio. We have to mention that he is the driving force behind this. He is very much responsible for designing US policy when it comes to these extrajudicial executions against Venezuela. And of course, those who are familiar with his history understand why. He is a rabid campaigner against anything that even has a shade of pink to it. But in particular, he views it as his mission to try to destroy the governments in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba above all. And so a person like him being in a position of authority and in a position of power is really quite dangerous, and I think helps explain much of what's happening. And of course, his closeness with this hardline Venezuelan opposition that I was talking about, this hardline opposition that doesn't have a democratic bone in its body. You know, Maria Corina Machado, I talked about how, she rose to prominence more recently, but she is a hard right actor. Even if you see some of her interviews today, right, the things that she's promising is basically shock therapy of an incredibly aggressive, post-Maduro scenario for Venezuela, where we see mass privatizations, flagrant violations of the 1999 Bolivarian Constitution, which guarantees a place for the role of the state in the economy and all the rest of it. So, she's a far-right actor. Her policies reflect that. If you want to have an idea or a conception of just how far-right she is, at one point she wrote a letter to Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, this was before October 7th and the genocide, but asking him to intervene, to help support her groups, her opposition groups efforts to oust Maduro from power. So somebody who is friendly and cozies up to somebody like Netanyahu is somebody who obviously shares his worldview and his ideology, and actually, even after she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, goes and publishes a message in support of him. So I think all of that is really quite telling. And even people who maybe don't share our ideologies here in this room have started to question the selection of Maria Corina Machado as the Nobel Peace Prize winner. And of course, right, it's worth saying her selection was clearly a political decision. It was a means of kind of appeasing Trump, who was pushing and seeking to be awarded the same prize. But also to elevate her, as I was saying, to put her in a position so that if a regime change effort, if a coup successfully ousted Maduro from power, that she would be seen as a quote unquote natural leadership to assume the leadership of Venezuela in that scenario. I don't think we have a lot of time to get into the nightmare scenario that would actually produce, but it's worth, I think, saying here that, of course, Venezuela is a country that's been ongoing a revolution since 1999 that has gone through a profound political deepening of consciousness, and there's no way that the revolutionary forces in Venezuela would ever accept Maria Corina Machado in the Palacio de Miraflores, the presidential palace. And so it would be a very chaotic situation. In fact, there was a really kind of dishonest piece in Reuters published recently, which kind of talks about how that's the government strategy to sow chaos. No, if there's chaos as a result of US intervention in Venezuela, it's because of the US. Now, when we were preparing for this event, I was asked to kind of also give some tools, something that you can use in terms of what to discuss with people about what's going on here. So, as we know, there's been a decades-long campaign to vilify Venezuela. And as much as it hurts somebody like myself who works for Venezuelanalysis, it causes me great lament. In a lot of ways, that information war was lost, particularly in the United States, right? It's very difficult to have a conversation about the Bolivarian Revolution, about Hugo Chavez, about Nicolás Maduro, with people who don't spend this time and energy to try to be informed about this. And so I actually don't think that that's the way to approach it, right? To try to say, I think instead, what we should emphasize is the defense of sovereignty and the defense of Venezuela's institutions and the risk that this kind of military adventure could produce. So when I talk about respecting Venezuela's sovereignty, is that first of all, remind people that the Venezuelan opposition has cast doubt, has denied every election that they didn't win. There's been more than 20 electoral processes, from local elections to national elections to referenda, just, an incredible exercise of voting in Venezuela. And of all of those, the only two that the opposition ever recognized was the ones they won. And everything else, they've cried wolf. And so I think it's quite difficult, certainly for me as somebody who closely follows Venezuela and has since 2005, to take their claims seriously. I think that the population or the people out there who are asking us to embrace their narrative about fraud in the last election are asking us to believe a group of actors that are dishonest, that have always promoted non-democratic means of change, and that their claims on this point actually are very difficult to take at face value. And the other thing I would say, which is that if we look at recent electoral processes in the region, we've seen very, very questionable results in places like Ecuador and places like El Salvador. And yet we don't hear the same kind of narrative being put out there that we do around Venezuela, because those are US allies, because those are convenient for Washington. And so the fact that you hear so much emphasis on, the lack of democratic credentials of this government is very much a narrative that's being driven by US policy goals in Latin America. And so I think that could be something that's useful for people to talk about respect for Venezuelan sovereignty, respect for Venezuelan institutions. So the Venezuelan institutions declared that Maduro was the winner. And I think that should be enough for us. And I think even if you wanted to kind of get into a back and forth about this, it's going to be difficult precisely because of the all-out information war that was engaged against Venezuela that makes it very difficult to proceed in that way. I also think that we should frame things in an anti-imperialist perspective. And I don't say that because that gives us kind of, more authority amongst left-wing circles, but I think it's actually really important to understand why in the face of an imperialist aggression in the region, the response should actually be informed by an anti-imperialist analysis. This is why I started my intervention here talking about, what are the geopolitical considerations that are at play here. This is happening because the United States wants to secure markets, it wants to secure the region, Latin America, as a place of cheap labor, of cheap materials, in order to, as I said previously, be able to get back on firm footing to dispute global hegemony again. And so if we understand it that way, then we have to understand, as I said again at the beginning, that this is even about Venezuela. Yes, there are individual actors like Rubio who are very much committed specifically to ousting Maduro in Venezuela and Díaz-Canel in Cuba and the rest of it. But we have to understand that this is very much about a lot of global considerations that are happening, and that should inform our analysis as well, to state explicitly that this is very much about the US and the interests of US capital and the bourgeoisie there to secure Latin America as a place where they can, as I said, have cheap resources, cheap labor, all of these things that are indispensable, that value transfer that happens from the global south to the north for the United States and its ruling class to be able to take the aggressive positions, for example, to potentially pursue a war against Iran, for example, because that would disrupt global oil supply. And so there's, Venezuela seen as this potential reserve of oil that we could, with a massive investment in a different government, could actually put back into the global markets. Excuse me. And so I think part of that has to be part of the way that we're responding to what's happening. And then just to kind of close here, of course, talking about the realities of the situation. And of course, I'm very grateful to see that we have people here from Venezuela who can speak more to what's happening there on the ground. But on the one hand, right, we're talking about an incredibly aggressive United States, a Trump government that is running afoul of international law. It wasn't that long ago, back in September, where Rubio said, I don't care what the UN has to say, right? These kinds of just total disregard for international institutions. And that's a very dangerous thing, again, not just for Venezuela, not just for Colombia, but all of the region. And so for those of you who are not familiar, I live and work in Mexico City. I also cover Mexican politics as well. And, I think a lot of also what we're seeing here is all trying to, like, little trial balloons to see how much further. At first we saw just attacks in the Caribbean, and then we saw them expanded into the Pacific off the coast of Colombia. And there was one about 2 weeks ago that was actually much closer to Mexico. It was off the coast of Guerrero, a southern state here. The reason we know that is because in one of these strikes, there was apparently a survivor, and the US called on Mexico's Coast Guard to do search and rescue to see if they could find it. Unfortunately, they actually never found the survivor. So he should probably be now counted as a victim. But it gives you an idea of just that this is about escalation after escalation after escalation. And I think ultimately it's part of laying the groundwork for, if we do see a further escalation, if we're unable to stop another escalation, attacks inside Venezuelan territory. And then perhaps eventually after that, if there isn't enough pushback, attacks on Mexican territory. And that would be a whole other can of worms that would be actually kind of difficult to predict the outcomes of. But you can see this, right? This is the aim. This is what they want. They want puppets like Noboa in Ecuador and Bukele in El Salvador. They want to oust any government, any movement that is inconvenient. One of the ways that they criticize Venezuela is going after their democratic credentials. And yet they also kind of go after Gustavo Petro, whose democratic credentials cannot really be called into question, right? Everybody recognized the results of that most recent presidential election. So all of that is just yet another way of them trying to, exert their influence in the region for the different reasons that I spelled out. And just to close, now I just wanted to say in terms of what we're seeing most recently. It was last week on Thursday, if I'm not mistaken, there was a vote in the Senate around the War Powers Resolution. So the War Powers Resolution, for those of you who aren't familiar, was passed in the context of the Vietnam War, basically for Congress to once again reassert its authority when it comes to the ability of the United States to declare war. And this vote on Thursday actually had a really good chance of passing. There had been a lot of really important lobbying and work being done, especially amongst the Republicans as well, around this resolution. So that's why on Wednesday, the day before, the night before, you saw this congressional meeting where they actually shared some more information with members of Congress coming from the White House and saying they don't have the legal authorization to do land strikes. And so we might accidentally misread that situation. I think they did that sharing of information and admitting that they don't have a legal basis for land strikes inside Venezuela because they were trying to head off this vote that was going to happen on the following day, and it worked, right? Ultimately, by a razor-thin margin, that resolution did not pass. And so what we're seeing is that there actually is a lot of potential here to weaken the forces that are pushing for this. On the one hand, we have the Venezuelan opposition, which is always kind of been really dishonest in their dealings with the White House. They've always overpromised. I suspect that what they had sold this latest adventure is by saying, no, this time, if you station some boats off the coast of Venezuela, you're going to see a break inside of the military in Venezuela, and they'll do the hard work for you. You won't even need to invade. You won't need to do land strikes. Obviously, that hasn't happened because, once again, the Venezuelan opposition oversold their abilities and I think had a really bad reading of the situation on the ground. And but we have to understand as well, the Trump coalition includes people who are opposed to war. And I think that actually can be exploited by us, by organizers, by people who are trying to change the narrative around this, to push for that. Do we really want the United States to go into yet another military misadventure, this time much, much closer to home, and one that would produce very serious repercussions for the entire region, right? I mean, if for the Trump coalition, the immigration question is really important to them. If there is a decapitation strike in Venezuela, if they try to take out the Vladimir Padrino, the defense secretary, or Maduro himself, then what we'll see is chaos and a massive outflow of people, right? This is not because of Venezuela in particular, but anytime you see a situation like this, you would definitely, yes, there's my cat is crying out there. You would definitely see, an outflow of migration, right? People fleeing from a conflict situation. And that would put incredible pressure on neighboring countries, but of course also Mexico, and it would really disrupt the Mexico-US relationship. So there's a lot of consequences that, again, I think are really quite difficult to predict. And so I think that can be exploited. I think even when we're dealing with people who are not sympathetic to our left-wing views, that there's space there. That's why this war powers resolution almost passed. And then all of that, again, finally, just to wrap this up, that the Trump government actually claims that they don't even have to inform Congress. They say that because members of the armed forces are not actually at any risk, that they don't have, it doesn't meet the threshold necessary of that legislation to have to inform. It's obviously not true. There's various opinions on whether or not that is the case, but that's their position. And so it's just about kind of them either generating the circumstances that they feel that they can continue to escalate and continue to push for a land strike, a decapitation strike into other countries, into Mexico, or to kind of wait it out, to wait to see if they can find the circumstances so that they continue forward. We shouldn't misread what's happened over the last little bit as a kind of as a waving of the white flag by this administration. I think if we remember who is in charge of this, Marco Rubio, he's not going to stop. He's very much full steam ahead about trying. If this one doesn't work, he'll invent something new. Right? This one happened to convince enough people in the cabinet that, oh yeah, this is about drugs and therefore we can move forward with it. And the narrative was, convenient for them at the time. But they'll invent a new one in the same way that they used to claim that Guaido was the president, right? Now they're claiming that, it's a criminal organization that runs the country. They'll invent some kind of new narrative, a new lie in order to continue with this. And so again, I think that brings us back to what I was saying about the need to really focus our analysis on imperialism and why is this actually happening? And then of course the response for you would have to be, what do we do about it, right? I always try to avoid give prescriptions to people, but I do think that there are some important lessons in terms of what we've been watching about, the very determined effort by Palestine solidarity activists to really change the narrative successfully, right? I mean, obviously we know, there are thousands of people who have been killed by Israel, lives that we'll never get back. But the narrative changed, and the narrative changed because of that diligent work to really kind of convince people about the need to defend counter-hegemonic, anti-hegemonic resistance organizations, or in the case of Venezuela, a government. And I think that's really important, and it shows that we can. And I think as we do this work, it's about finding all of these spaces. I'm so grateful. I mean, how many participants here? Almost 100 people here listening to this. And I think this is the kind of work that we need to be doing. And of course, reaching out to Venezuelan comrades as well, so they can tell the narrative differently. Because as well, I think it's also, one final thing, is important to talk about the place of the Venezuelan population. The defense of Venezuela's sovereignty is going to be the defense of in a popular manner. I'm citing some of the conversation I had with Chris Gilbert, who writes for Monthly Review. He's also a friend of ours here at Venezuelanalysis. And the conception of how Venezuela intends to defend its territory in the face of U.S. intervention, in the face of a U.S. invasion, is one that is very much wedded to this idea of the civic military union, that it's the population. It's not just the armed forces, but it's the armed forces together with the population. That's why you've seen this explosion of people signing up to join the Bolivarian militia. That's why we see the radical grassroots revolutionary organizations in Venezuela training around how to engage in the resistance of this. And I don't want this to happen, obviously, but if something like that happens, I think it's also important for us to defend the legitimacy of that violence, of Venezuelans resisting and defending their territory. And we should be unequivocal about it. We should be absolutely clear about this, that it is perfectly legitimate to fire back at the people invading your territory. We will not ever tolerate US boots on our soil. And that shouldn't ever be up for debate. And that if that means a guerrilla struggle in the streets of Venezuela, in the countryside of Venezuela, that is legitimate, absolutely legitimate. And we should defend it on that basis. And there were people who say, oh, this criminal organization, you don't have time for that. It's absolutely correct. Because if we allow them to get away with it in Venezuela, which we won't, they'll try to do it everywhere. And that means that me, here, will have to go pick up a gun to go fight the gringos who are trying to invade Mexico. So, all that to say, I really appreciate everybody being here. I know I went through a lot, and I know it's a lot of information, and things are changing really rapidly. So I also invite everybody to of course, keep in touch with myself individually, if you want, with Venezuelanalysis, and of course, DIC. I think it's really important that a prominent leftist organization like the DSA, refuses to fall victim to these narratives, these attempts to try to even corner progressive and leftist forces in the United States to declare, Venezuela dictatorship and, whatever they have, they get, it's coming to them. No. Kudos to you for resisting and continuing to resist. And thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm really looking forward to the rest of this. And of course, any questions, we'll handle those in the question and answer period.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jose Luis. We have a couple minutes still. If you could just, for people who might not be aware, could you recapitulate what specifically the United States has been doing in regards to Venezuela with the attacks and the deployments, just in case people aren't familiar with that those facts in that immediate context?
Sure, just as short as possible, right? I began by saying that these attacks that we see that we saw in the Caribbean in September, it's just the latest iteration of regime change efforts by the United States, and they have seen various manifestations. The support for the opposition, which was pursuing an insurrectionary strategy, the support for Juan Guaidó and his false claim to the presidency, the support for the 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez, the support for the oil lockout shortly after that, the Obama declaration that Venezuela represents an unusual and extraordinary threat, which, interestingly enough, is the same decree that is renewed year after year after year by every U.S. president on a yearly basis since then. It's actually the original 2015 Obama decree. And we've seen since then Trump, Biden, Trump again, and they always renew it. And so there is a bipartisan consensus when it comes to that. And of course, it's always driven with the notion of wanting to oust the Maduro government. In terms of specifically what we've seen is extrajudicial executions deemed as such by the United Nations in and around northern half of South America, but with a creep moving each time to further into more territories, into more waters, closer to Mexico, closer to Colombia. Sort of a rogue government is what I've called it, acting in a rogue fashion, killing, assassinating people who, and there was a really interesting report from the Associated Press that it turns out is mostly, they're just low-income people who, some of them are just fishermen. They have nothing to do with drug trafficking, and some of them, are, for a payout, have been involved with these drug smuggling boats. But this, the narrative they tried to put is that these boats are destined for the United States. It's a lie. They can't make it that far. They would have to refuel dozens of times before even making it close. These are clearly are vessels that are being used to transit drugs, and that is, we're taking their word for it because there's no evidence when you blow a boat out of the water within the region. So a lot of them happened actually just off the coast of Venezuela near Trinidad and Tobago, which is a very small sliver of water. In fact, the Trinidad and Tobago Fishermen's Association, their exact name escapes me at the moment, actually recommends that the fishermen not go out anymore because they run the risk of being bombed by drones, most likely. It appears that this is a drone campaign above all. And then, of course, what we saw also is in the Pacific, right, as expanding it, killing people off the coast of Colombia, and as I said earlier, also off of Mexico, in order to put pressure. I think a lot of it, like I said, this is very much a pressure tactic. I think they were hoping for an easy regime change operation. They were promised, probably, most likely, by the Venezuelan hardline opposition, that this would be easy, that if they just put these boats off the coast of Venezuela, they would see issues. Obviously, that has not happened. And probably won't happen. And so, this is where they're now kind of in a place where we have to wait to see what their next step is. We have to see if they feel that they can generate the conditions, or the conditions come about on their own for them to have a further escalation, which could include, as I said, decapitation strikes, trying to kill the leadership in Venezuela, but also could very quite possibly include an invasion of Venezuelan territory, and of course also further escalations, these kinds of attacks, not just in Venezuela, but throughout the entire region, against anything, any government, any person who is seen as challenging U.S. control over the region.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jose Luis. Thank you very much also, Jana, who has been doing the English to Spanish interpretation for Jose Luis's section. The interpretation work is very difficult, and we very much appreciate it. So thank you very much. Before we move to our next speaker, I do want to paste in the chat for everybody a couple of links that are useful. So we have here, the Venezuela Working Group has created a chapter toolkit on the DSA IC website, where you can see a lot of this information. You can see a lot of the other information that the Venezuela Working Group, like different webinars we've done in the past, as well as information specific to this particular new round of imperialist aggression. It's my opinion that it's going to be very, very important in resisting this move towards war and move to more imperialist aggression, that DSA chapters get involved in this work. So if you are part of a chapter, you want to help in whatever local way you can as a chapter to do this anti-war work, I highly recommend you consult the toolkit. Another thing you can do is you can join the IC. I always recommend people join the IC. It's a great group of people, and you can get more involved with DSA's international work. And you can also join the Venezuela Working Group. So we have a form there to get involved that way. If, for example, you don't necessarily have the time commitment to join the international committee itself, but you want to get involved with your chapter, you can use the Join the Venezuela Working Group link and get in contact with us, so that we can help support your chapter and with whatever sort of anti-war work you want to do. Wonderful. So our next speaker is Mónica Mancera, who lives in Caracas. She doesn't speak English. She's going to be in Spanish. So if you want to listen to her, make sure, and you don't speak Spanish, make sure you use the interpretation button and hit English. And our lovely interpreter, Jose, who's also doing a tremendous amount of work this evening, will interpret the Spanish to English for you. So without further ado, welcome, Mónica. Thank you very much for attending and speaking with us this evening. If you could go ahead and tell us how things are going in Caracas from your perspective.
Un súper, súper abrazo a todas, todos y todes, porque ya esta acción, ya este encuentro, juntos, que me hayan convocado, gracias Tristán, Luisa, David, que nos volvamos a encontrar, es de vital importancia. Ya esto es una ganancia enorme para nosotros y nosotras los venezolanos. José, tú indícame si puedo seguir hablando, si me detengo. Eso necesito tener ese feedback contigo. José, perfecto.
Oh, okay. 1 second here. Jose, can you go ahead and
Ah,
try
puedo hablar un
speaking?
poco más rápido.
Jose, will you make sure you're in the
Bien,
English
perfecto.
channel?
Sí, es para estar sintonizado. Ya esto es ganancia.
Okay,
Eh,
perfect, perfect.
Nosotros somos un pueblo de paz y esa paz la tenemos en este instante, seguimos en paz nuestra cotidianidad. Cuando Tristán me envió un mensaje, ¿no?, para hacerme esta convocatoria, de inmediato le dije que sí, porque una cosa es lo que en este espacio, lo que ustedes pueden ver a través de toda la mediación, de toda la mediática, de todas esas narrativas, como bien José Luis Granados Ceja, que le mando un abrazo, que le llegue a México, están planteando. Ustedes pueden venir a Venezuela, pueden venir a Caracas y disfrutar enormemente de nuestra cotidianidad. Y ustedes dirán, ¿cuál es la cotidianidad de los venezolanos? Y les hablo en particular desde la capital, desde Caracas. Un pueblo alegre, creo que una de nuestros focos o lo que nos ha hecho sortear las ya 1039 medidas coercitivas unilaterales, las mal llamadas sanciones contra nosotros, lo que hemos podido ya durante una década exactamente aguantar, resistir, es la resiliencia a través del humor, a través de la alegría, a través de la empatía, a través de la solidaridad. Hay dichos como donde comen uno, comen dos, y eso hace que un momento, porque esto no es nuevo, eh, el hecho de tener, y eso es otro elemento, por supuesto que está la amenaza allí, están esos barcos acá en la entrada de nuestro país, en los portaaviones, o sea, está todo en Puerto Rico, que ya vamos a escuchar a los compañeros que van a desarrollarlo. Es decir, está allí, pero así como está eso, hay un cotidiano, o sea, son 1039 medidas coercitivas que pesan sobre nosotros, que están presentes y que eso se traduce en las transferencias internacionales, eso se traduce en elementos que también ha sido una virtud, o sea, cómo ese pisarnos, cómo eso entonces nosotros buscamos ese darle la vuelta, y ese es otro de nuestros componentes culturales, que es cómo nosotros le damos la vuelta a nuestra situación. ¿Cómo resolvemos? La palabra resolver en Venezuela es un tótem. Nosotros los venezolanos resolvemos. Y eso ha hecho entonces que esta escalada permanente desde el año 2015, desde que el presidente Barack Obama dijo que nosotros somos una amenaza inusual y extraordinaria, y eso se empezó a traducir en una primera escala, lo alimentario. Y entonces, y ahí ya les estoy respondiendo el cómo estamos hoy. En una primera etapa, desde lo alimenticio, entonces ya el 90% hoy en Venezuela, siendo un país de gran dependencia petrolera, y si por ahí está Yolimar, nuestra hermana Yolimar pudiera hablar de eso más que yo, venezolana, en la que tuvimos el privilegio de estar en el 2022 con ustedes en una brigada feminista con el DSA. ¿Cómo nosotros entonces pasamos de ser un país importador a gran escala a nosotros hoy día sostenernos sobre la producción nacional? Eso se llama resolver. Y eso, sin lugar a dudas, en las medidas coercitivas jugaron un papel importante. Entonces, ¿cómo aquello que contra la pared, ese contra la pared se revierte en potencialidad? Y esa potencialidad desde el humor, desde la alegría, desde la fiesta. Hoy día en Caracas, o sea, estamos celebrando la Navidad. Desde hace unos años, y justamente, y eso obedece a que la Navidad para nosotros y en general para la región es de gran algarabía. Entonces, bueno, ¿qué es lo que ha hecho nuestro gobierno nacional? Ha adelantado, ha hecho más, ha extendido el tema navideño, porque eso permite entonces el impulso de la economía, el abrazo familiar, los circuitos de intercambio, por ejemplo, en una festividad clave como es la Navidad, como pueden ser los carnavales, como puede ser la Semana Santa. Estoy hablando de 3 momentos festivos en Venezuela donde lo que implica el encuentro, y eso es otro de nuestros componentes de empoderamiento. Nosotros vivimos encontrándonos, vivimos abrazándonos, no nos aislamos. Justamente cuando estamos a mayor presión, mayor encuentro. A mayor presión, mayor unión. Entonces, en una Caracas como hoy, ante una amenaza, que esta amenaza se traduce que como el 28 de julio nosotros decidimos por nuestros alcaldes, y que es una gran mayoría de la revolución bolivariana, los contendientes ganadores, entonces, bueno, no les queda otra, y ese es uno de los últimos elementos. Empezaron por lo alimenticio, en el caso de Barack Obama, hasta ahorita el presidente Trump o esta administración, con lo que es el ámbito militar. Es decir, hemos pasado por varias dinámicas, primero por lo alimenticio, luego por lo financiero, que es todo en la cuestión del SWIFT, o sea, de cómo cortaron todo lo que implica las transacciones internacionales, desde el ámbito social, el fomento de la migración, de que cualquier destino es mejor que estar en nuestra amada patria. Entonces, cómo estos componentes que se han ido trabajando a lo largo, por supuesto, de la mano de la derecha venezolana, en ese fomento que se ha dado, y ahora tanto es así que quieren retornar a todos nuestros hermanos migrantes, justamente que fueron estimulados a partir de todas estas medidas coercitivas, porque se ve, bueno, es que es un fracaso la revolución bolivariana, no, es que hay una asfixia sobre nuestro país. Entonces, bueno, mientras uno nos quedamos buscando esa potencialidad, fomentando, abrazando la soberanía, que es un aspecto clave del que habló José Luis, o sea, nuestra clave acá es la soberanía, y la soberanía es independencia, ese que nosotros sí podemos y sí queremos, y es nuestro espacio, son nuestros recursos. Aquí nosotros somos hermanos, somos un pueblo hermano, el pueblo estadounidense y el pueblo venezolano somos hermanos. Y bueno, para eso hay que hacer intercambios, para eso hay que, bueno, la comercialización, o sea, aquí no se está hablando de que hay una contra o ser anti-estadounidense. No, todo lo contrario, aquí estamos. Pero la cuestión es que es ese parámetro que están toda la administración o todas estas diversas administraciones a lo largo de esta década, porque bueno, ahorita estamos basados en el presidente Trump, pero realmente ha sido una década encima. Ha sido una década con una misma política, una política que por supuesto sí nos ha dolido, sí hemos sufrido, sí. Y no estoy hablando desde la victimización, de que, bueno, aquí nos estamos, no, sino que cómo desde a partir de esa asfixia, de ese sufrimiento, porque, bueno, Venezuela históricamente no ha sido un país de migrar, sino de recibir. Nosotros históricamente hemos recibido, bueno, los migrantes europeos, a los latinoamericanos, justamente porque hemos sido un país con múltiples riquezas que, bueno, que han permitido que para qué vamos a ir a otro país si en el nuestro tenemos todo. Si salimos a estudiar, a visitar y con la misma regresamos. Entonces, claro, es un hecho inédito esta migración masiva que se ve como que la más grande del mundo. Mentira, pero básicamente sobre esa narrativa se ha basado eso. Entonces, bueno, es la misma narrativa de que a Nicolás le quedan los días contados. Que le quedan contados si estamos ahorita en el triunfo en las presidenciales de julio 2024. ¿En qué estamos? Y cuando digo que estamos todos, porque nosotros abrazamos nuestro plan de la patria. El plan de la patria es el programa, el proyecto político con el que el periodo gubernamental se va a desarrollar. Entonces, bueno, estamos ahorita en las 7T. ¿Y cuáles son esas 7T? En el ámbito económico, de seguir fomentando la producción nacional, porque no olvidemos que hemos sido un país de una dependencia petrolera, ha sido nuestro principal elemento. pero bueno, estamos en esa diversificación de comer lo que producimos. En lo social, el tema de emprender, de no estar atado solamente al empleo formal, sino cómo los emprendimientos hay la potencialidad creativa. Recientemente, en finales del 2024, se decretó a Caracas como ciudad creativa de la música y entonces eso hace que desde lo cultural haya una potenciación de nuestras expresiones, nuestra idiosincrasia musical, por ejemplo, para la exportación. Entonces, como ahora, desde lo simbólico, nosotros también, bueno, exportamos desde lo alimenticio hasta nuestras expresiones, estar entonces en ese concierto de la UNESCO, de esa red de las ciudades creativas, como nosotros entonces está la vocería venezolana desde lo musical, por ejemplo. Eso es algo, y eso hace que al tener la ciudad creativa musical en Venezuela, entonces cómo nosotros podemos exportar esto que les estoy comentando, esta alegría, este entusiasmo. Es decir, sí, puede ser que estamos alertas, estamos pilas. Yo creo que aquí, José, si puedes desarrollar un poco el tema de lo pila. Nosotros somos pilas. Entonces, bueno, tú nos vas a amenazar. Ya han sido tantas las asfixias que ya no nos las calamos. Y entonces eso hace que lo que ustedes ven, si navegan, van a ver que los adultos mayores entonces se están alistando. Eso es, no me la calo. Entonces, claro, hay mucho entusiasmo, hay mucha algarabía, pero también somos un pueblo, esta palabra que es arrecho, somos un pueblo arrecho, pero en paz. O sea, no buscamos meternos con nadie, sino más bien vengan con nosotros y vamos a disfrutar de lo que la vida nos está brindando, que es este momento. Es un elemento de estar presente y compartir. Pero si tú me buscas problemas, te voy a responder. En ese marco de lo que consultaba Tristan, ¿qué está sucediendo en Venezuela? El día de hoy, por ejemplo, activaron, eso tiene un nombre más complejo, pero es como los ejercicios militares. Ya se pasó un estadio de la práctica militar. Entonces, bueno, en ese ejercicio sí está desplegado por el país la milicia, todos los componentes de la milicia, porque bueno, como somos un país de paz, nosotros no estamos cada ratico, y hablando en términos de pueblo, pendientes de estar activando circuitos de guerra, de eso de estar alistados a disparar, o sea, nada de eso. Entonces, bueno, ante una amenaza hay que prepararnos. Y en esa amenaza, el ministro de Defensa, Padrino López, nos alertó a todos, mira, vamos a hacer unos ejercicios de defensa. ¿Por qué? Porque hay que desempolvar, hay que activarnos. Activarnos, eso sí, sin provocar. El presidente Trump está, y así lo vemos nosotros, está como, hay un comentario que son de los jóvenes, como quítame la pajita, que es como quítame aquí para entonces enfrentarnos, golpearnos. Entonces nosotros, eso es lo que nosotros lo vemos a él. Es decir, lo vemos realmente, y por favor que no suene ofensa, pero lo vemos así como que, pero ¿qué te pasa? Si nosotros lo menos que queremos es confrontarnos con nadie. Y sabemos, entendemos y estamos muy conscientes que el ejército estadounidense es uno de los más poderosos del planeta Tierra, lo sabemos, porque lo hemos visto en cada vuelta, ahorita todo ese apoyo a los israelíes, o sea, para nosotros eso es inconcebible. Y eso nos lleva a que nuestros hermanos que están de la derecha, porque al final de cuentas son hermanos nuestros, son venezolanos, no vamos a negar de ellos. Para nosotros es inconcebible que ellos les estén pidiendo al presidente Trump que nos sigan asfixiando, ellos estando en el extranjero, porque eso es lo peor. Lo peor es que ellos están en otra tierra para poderse sostener financieramente, pidiéndonos que nos bombardeen a nosotros. Entonces, y ya pensándolo como votante, como yo tengo remotamente pensado, yo soy chavista, revolucionario, eso que quede claro, pero, ajá, si yo me paro de una manera objetiva, entre comillas, y me preguntan, tengo mis dudas de la revolución bolivariana, ¿tú crees que con alguien que pida que bombardeen el país, que yo vaya a votar por una María Corina Machado, por este señor Edmundo González Urrutia? O sea, Es decir, eso, entre los mismos opositores, y ese es otro de los componentes que está sucediendo hoy en Venezuela, la misma oposición. Y estoy hablando no de la oposición de las dirigencias políticas, no estoy hablando de eso, sino del común, o sea, de las Mónicas. Lo menos que nadie en Venezuela quiere ningún tipo de intervención. Así lo haya pedido la misma, la llamamos premio de la guerra realmente, en vez de la paz, del Nobel de la Paz, el Nobel de la Guerra. Lo menos que, es decir, ella con esa acción o con este cúmulo de acciones en Venezuela, no estoy hablando en el caso de Miami o España, que es decir, donde hay grandes, ya podemos hablar del tema de la diáspora, grandes diásporas, sino en Venezuela, opositores en Venezuela, lo menos eh, ya no quieren saber, y eso es otro de los elementos. ¿Qué está sucediendo en Venezuela, en Caracas? Me preguntaba Tristan. Bueno, que la oposición ya ni siquiera quiere hablar, ni siquiera quiere hablar de estrategias para tumbar la revolución bolivariana, sino lo que queremos es trabajar. Y ahí entonces está un elemento permanente que es el trabajo. Hay una situación, porque por supuesto, al tener medidas coercitivas, eso, por supuesto, la renta baja, por supuesto, hemos sorteado muchas crisis. Y ahorita, en este momento, todavía hay pesar. Estamos saliendo, ya no estamos en el foso, estábamos en el sótano 5. Ya no estamos en el sótano 5, ya estamos en el piso 2. Es decir, estamos saliendo de una asfixia económica importante. Han sido ya 20 trimestres de ascenso económico. Sin embargo, hay un juego, por ejemplo, con el dólar, el tema del dólar, o sea, que es el asunto de la moneda de intercambio acá, con respecto al bolívar, el tema inflacionario. Esos son grandes temas que nos ocupan. Y eso tiene que ver, porque a mayor asfixia, mayor angustia, mayor inflación. Es decir, es una dinámica compleja, pero que nosotros entrompamos. Es decir, estamos en el sótano 5 o en el sótano 10, ya estamos en el piso 2, es decir, ya vamos mejorando. Sin embargo, hay que seguir trabajando. Entonces, para nosotros y nosotras, nuestro punto de honor es el trabajo. Entonces, un opositor, y estoy hablando ahora de Consecomercio, Fedecámaras, que son esas federaciones donde se aglutina lo económico, ya ahora sí dialogan con el gobierno. Antes que se prestaron para sabotear, ahora se sientan con el equipo presidencial para ver cómo hacemos, porque esa es la otra. Nosotros los venezolanos somos un país consumidor. Entonces, ese empresario que se fue de Venezuela a otro país, entonces sigue siendo migrante, y al ser migrante, entonces las condiciones son distintas que en su país. Entonces, o bien retornaron o los que se quedaron se dieron cuenta de que esta no es la manera de lograr cambios, sino más bien en ese, bueno, no estoy de acuerdo contigo, no estoy de acuerdo con ese sistema que tú estás planteando, pero, oye, negociemos para tener yo mejores condiciones como empresariado. Ahí ha habido unas negociaciones, que eso, bueno, un economista pudiera desarrollarlo mejor que yo, pudiera explicarlo mejor que yo, con datos de cuáles han sido ese ganar-ganar. Muchos de los hermanos del chavismo ponen como que, oye, que el presidente se ha desviado del camino del socialismo. Sin embargo, ha habido ciertas flexibilizaciones para poder llegar al mismo punto, que es lo que se denomina la construcción de esa modernización económica. Y entonces, bueno, el tema de los emprendimientos, el tema de los créditos, ha hecho entonces que, bueno, esas ciertas flexibilizaciones para entonces poder transar con este empresariado sin descuidar el ámbito social, que son el tema de las misiones, grandes misiones de la protección social de forma permanente, que no haya descuidos. Que todavía falta, sí, claro, cómo no. Cómo no, que todavía falta seguir metiéndole mano al tema de los salarios, claro, claro que sí, pero se ha logrado una avanzada de cierta estabilidad y por ahí entonces ustedes leerán, oye, pero el tema cambiario está afectando. Por supuesto, si tú tienes en la puerta del Caribe un montón de barcos, aviones y demás que están esperando, están loquitos por una orden, aunque bueno, es relativo porque el jefe del Comando Sur acaba de renunciar. Entonces, bueno, que hay una obsesión hacia nosotros, por supuesto que eso impacta en la economía. Entonces, bueno, ahí viene como esa desesperación cambiaria y entonces se desajusta el bolívar y ahí entonces se nos desbarata lo que estamos sólidos y en ascenso. Entonces, bueno, ahí estamos ahorita en la vida cotidiana un poco apretados. Pero eso tiene que ver con esta estrategia actual, que es la militar. Otro ejemplo, muchas infraestructuras venezolanas, por supuesto, porque no había plata, había falta de mantenimiento, entonces, bueno, estaban corroídas, pues ya no. Hay un tema de la recuperación de los patrimonios, de la actualización o de esa mantener, de sostener el mantenimiento de nuestras infraestructuras y eso entonces que fomenta el turismo. Cada semana estamos recibiendo y entonces estamos hablando de las 7T, que es el tema de la geopolítica, que es el tema de la multipolaridad. Estamos recibiendo turistas rusos, chinos, es decir, estamos recibiendo turistas de otras latitudes y eso implica entonces, desde el motor del turismo, que es otra de las estrategias, los llamados motores en Venezuela, y la dinámica del motor que implica mayor ingreso en esa diversificación de la economía nacional. Entonces, bueno, hemos recibido permanentemente, pero para fomentar el turismo tienes que tener condiciones. En este momento que también está sucediendo, actualmente la marca país, que es una instancia donde se fomenta el comercio exterior, está abriendo caminos, está en ese intercambio comercial con China, por ejemplo, y están ávidos del cacao, ávidos del café, es decir, de otros rubros que son de alta exigencia, de alta gama para nosotros. El caso del cacao es uno de los mejores del mundo, y no entrando en competencia, es que dentro de esos indicadores del cacao, el venezolano es muy deseado, pero es por la latitud en la que nosotros nos encontramos. Es decir, la producción del cacao es una de las más exquisitas. Entonces, ¿por qué no comercializar el cacao? En ese punto se está, por ejemplo, con la República Popular China. Y así sucesivamente con lo que tiene que ver la comercialización. Entonces, claro, no hemos parado de trabajar, no hemos parado, es decir, al mismo tiempo es que estamos pilas, estamos atentos, al mismo tiempo ya esto lo hemos vivido, vamos adelante, ahí como estamos como curtidos en cuanto al tema de las amenazas, de las narrativas. Por supuesto, lo menos que queremos es que suceda, pero también estamos convencidos de que ya este capítulo lo hemos vivido desde diversas aristas, que la última que le queda es la militar. Yo espero de verdad que la administración en general, no estoy hablando del presidente Trump, sino en general, entren en razón. Y ese entrar en razón es de parar. Y el hecho de que ustedes me estén escuchando forma parte de este trabajo de hormiguita, de mayor conciencia, para realmente no despertar una catástrofe en el Caribe. Porque no es solamente, como bien decía José Luis, no es solamente para Venezuela, es para la región. Desatar una guerra hacia nosotros es desatar, bueno, los demonios en toda la región. Porque uno de los elementos que no está midiendo esta administración es que realmente nosotros abrazamos nuestra patria. Y es una patria extensa, es grande. Entonces, claro, ahí es donde viene esa unión cívico-militar. Si bien es cierto, yo soy del mundo de las letras, pero en algo puedo contribuir, porque quieta no me voy a quedar. Y esta misma actitud que puedo expresarles en este momento, a la par, Venezuela entera está desde esa perspectiva. Que hay un sector de la oposición, pero ese sector de la oposición lo que dice es no queremos guerra. Quizás no van a estar en la unión cívico-militar, por supuesto, pero su posición es no queremos guerra. No, o sea, no queremos seguir adelante porque eso nos atrasa nos atrasa a toda costa y por supuesto es un peligro para la vida. ¿Qué está sucediendo? Ese es otro de los elementos. Y ahí, bueno, con eso creo que le respondía a Tristán, ese sentimiento general del pueblo, pueblo empoderado. Y ese pueblo empoderado, ese pueblo arrecho que vamos para adelante, estoy hablando en términos muy venezolanos, ayúdame ahí en la traducción, José, está el tema de la comunalización del poder. Para el próximo 23, o sea, la semana que viene, estamos 11, la próxima semana, el 23 de noviembre, está la próxima consulta al poder popular. ¿En qué se basa eso? En que los países tenemos planes de desarrollo, o sea, están los planes operativos de la nación, o sea, que son los POA, pues. Y ahí están todas las políticas. Pero a la par, en este democratizar el poder, ese democratizar el Estado, de la comunalización del Estado, están las comunas, que somos las organizaciones, las comunidades organizadas. Bueno, las comunidades organizadas, a pesar de que hay políticas establecidas y hay un presupuesto de la nación, eso está allí, a la par, con estos ingresos, más allá del petróleo, esos ingresos se reparten a través de los proyectos que van a concurso, o sea, que van a votación, que van a asambleas, que se sistematizan, se presentan, que son las necesidades más inmediatas de las comunidades. Y tiene que ver con la reparación de los espacios, tiene que ver con el aporte para fomentar los emprendimientos a la microescala de las comunidades y así sucesivamente. Eso dentro de los consejos comunales, que es el primer arito, los consejos comunales, luego las comunas, luego los circuitos comunales. Allí hay una batería de proyectos. Esa batería de proyectos entran a votación y después de la votación, los tres que ganen por circuitos, por comunas, ese dinero se les da inmediato, o sea, pasa directo a estas comunidades, ejecutan y rinden cuentas. Y esa rendición de cuentas es pública, o sea, cuando hablo de todos estos elementos, es permanentemente en la comunidad que se hace este monitoreo, este seguimiento de lo que se ha escogido como proyecto. En este año ya esta es la tercera consulta y se han hecho consultas inéditas como a los jóvenes. Los jóvenes también han propuesto sus proyectos y entonces eso hace que haya de esta construcción del sujeto político, porque esto es otro elemento. Los jóvenes están muy distantes del tema político. Bueno, una forma de acercarlo es la participación, es fomentar permanentemente la participación. Recientemente, en el mes de julio, hubo una votación para ya con esto voy cerrando, ese fomento de la participación juvenil. Y finalmente, el éxito, la productividad. Ese es el tercer elemento que me dice Tristán como para disparar la conversa. ¿Cuáles han sido los éxitos en este momento? Lograr la productividad, lograr, y más allá de la dependencia petrolera, lograr las condiciones para que haya menos migraciones, la deconstrucción de las narrativas imperantes, de saber que si bien es cierto, esto está sucediendo en el Caribe, en las puertas de nuestra patria, tenemos que continuar, pase lo que pase. Ese es el éxito en bloque que hemos consolidado. Los desafíos, las dificultades, todavía son 1039 medidas coercitivas unilaterales. En la medida que nosotros tengamos las medidas coercitivas unilaterales, por supuesto que es un peso grande, porque estamos en desventaja con respecto al mundo. Y prueba de ello es la Revolución Cubana. No hace falta que idealice escenario. Ahí está la Revolución Cubana. Son 60 años de bloqueo. Entonces, claro, nosotros no queremos pasar exactamente lo mismo porque realmente es muy difícil. ¿Ves? Eso es ese es el desafío, que poder erradicar estas medidas coercitivas unilaterales para seguir viviendo. y para vivir bien, para vivir en armonía. Y bueno, y tener este intercambio, que ustedes puedan venir para acá tranquilamente, a abrazarnos y a disfrutar de lo que es esta venezolanidad. Muchísimas gracias por esta convocatoria y abierta a las preguntas.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. So with that, we'll move to our Puerto Rico working group, who are going to talk about how this U.S. military aggression is affecting Puerto Rico and the remilitarization of Puerto Rico. I'll go ahead and share your slides, Lorna and Edwin, and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay. And wonderful. Okay. And we'll share those slides. They're right here. Wonderful. So go ahead.
Hey everyone, I'm Lorna. I'm part of panelists DSA in Florida, and I'm the co-chair of the Puerto Rico Working Group, along with Edwin. If you want to introduce yourself too.
Yeah, hi comrades. Edwin Diaz, from Puerto Rico. Un saludo a nuestros hermanos y hermanas de Venezuela. Un placer en conocerlos. Sí, soy de Tampa, DSA. I live like 30 minutes away from Lorna, so we're from different chapters, but we're like a bridge away of difference. So we're both in Florida. Yeah.
Hola, Mónica y José, gracias. Buenas noches. So we are going to cover this in 3 different parts. The history and Vieques, the current remilitarization, and then the political climate currently in Puerto Rico. You can go to the next slide. So we have a visual here of what is known as the oldest colony in the world. So 1493, 1898, it was a Spanish colony where it was a strategic outpost and defense point for protecting the treasures and, the silver and from the pirates, and protecting it on its way back to España, to Spain. So then 1898, we're going way back to the beginning. 1898, the U.S. invaded, as they had long been looking for an opportunity to seize the last Spanish colonies in the Caribbean as part of their geopolitical interest that was influenced by the Monroe Doctrine. The war with Spain was the perfect excuse to carry out the takeover. Next slide. So then in 1917, the Jones Act was passed, which allowed Puerto Ricans to become U.S. citizens. And then shortly after, they were able to be drafted. And then Boricuas, which Puerto Ricans are called Boricuas because it was originally named Boriquen. And we've fought in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Persian Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And Congress rules Puerto Rico without the people's consent. The scope of Congress's powers of Puerto Rico is unlimited. So they are second-class citizens, could not vote for president, and the governor was a U.S. or cannot vote for president. And the governor was a U.S. appointee until 1947. So even though we could go fight in wars, Puerto Ricans had no, say. Next slide. So then 1952, there was a Commonwealth status. Puerto Rico got its own constitution, but remained a U.S. territory with limited rights. And ultimate authority rests with U.S. Congress. So when in 1953, the UN removed Puerto Rico from its list of colonies, it, claimed its full self-government, but the island fundamental colonial status never actually changed. Next slide. So this is what it looks like. All of the military presence in Puerto Rico, past and present. During the 20th century, the US built 25 military bases in Puerto Rico, including major ones like Roosevelt Roads, Vieques, Fort Buchanan, Ramey Air Force Base, except for Fort Buchanan, these bases had closed until recently, but still host limited military or guard activity. Next slide. So now we get into Vieques. Edwin, if you want to take over about Vieques.
Yes, thanks, Lorna. Vieques is a little island, so Puerto Rico is the main island, but then we have an archipelago. Vieques is what we call La Isla Nena for us, and um, Vieques has its history that in terms of it was used as a military bastion for the U.S. Marines. From 1941 to 2003, the Marines expropriated and restricted approximately 3/4 of Vieques for military missiles and bomb practices that included the use of napalm, uranium, Agent Orange, and cyanide. That also included, interestingly, a fun fact. There is a beach called Playa Caracas. It's one of the few beaches in Vieques. That beach was also controlled by the U.S. Marines. Actually, right now, it was it was one of the beaches that was actually able to be saved and cleaned, and it's a beautiful beach, Playa Caracas, which I think it's an interesting connection with Venezuela, since it's the name of their capital. Um, the Navy used the island for bombing and military exercises, causing significant environmental health damage that continued after the base closed in 2003. So, while in 1999 there was a proof that there was a 31% increase in cancer for people who lived in Vieques compared to the rest of the island. There was a lot of these bombing practices that affected the water, affected specifically fishermen were the ones who, like Vieques, had a big economy based on fishing, and that economy was heavily affected by the bombing practices of the U.S. Marines. There was also there was also testimonies, particularly of residents calling the police because there were Marine soldiers knocking on their doors at 3 a.m. in the morning because they found out that a young woman would live in the house. So a lot of them would search to sexually abuse women in Vieques. So some of those cases did happen. There were also cases where I would like to read this excerpt because I think it's really important for that. The U.S. Navy affected Vieques on ecology, also captured great attention. Since 1947, the Navy used napalm, depleted uranium, carcinogens, and other toxic substances at levels that violated even the own Pentagon's regulations. Elevated levels of several contaminants have impacted the water, food chain, and land. Basically, studies conducted by the Puerto Rico Health Department found that compared to Puerto Rico, Vieques had a higher rate of cancer, asthma, diabetes, hypertension, and mental illness. Some environmental advisors consider that the U.S. Navy violated including a number of federal laws, including the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and by the end of 1999, at least 55 Vieques cancer patients and landowners had filed a $109 million class action suit against the Navy. That still is in process. And it was a case where even people who were protesting in Vieques also had ended up having cancer. Some of them ended up having cancer, or they ended up passing away. I think it was in 2022, 2021. There were also people that passed away from cancer as well, in that sense. In 1941, but then I think it was around 1999 where, like we say in Puerto Rico, eso fue la última gota en la copa, right? Because a soldier, there was a firing, and a soldier misfired a missile and killed a Puerto Rican guard, and that it created a huge outrage for a lot of resistance and a lot of protests that were already happening. Most of the
If
people who
you
were
go to the next
protesting.
slide,
Yeah,
there's
you can go to the next
photos
slide.
coming up. Yeah, after
Um,
this. Next slide. Yeah, there's
Right, so that's right. Those were the major protests that happened in Vieques. Um, there were these cases where most of the protests that started from 20th century were the very own local fishermen and the residents in Vieques. And then some people started to join this protest. But the issue is that in 1999, that's when that misfire caused a huge outrage. And there was basically a huge protest. People started to go in Vieques and enter into the restriction zone. Next, please. Next slide. So these protests, for example, were civil disobedience mostly. They entered for example, the restriction zone beaches and they occupied them. This was able to actually not allow the Marines to practice their bombings. People stood here for months, like people were arrested constantly. There was also cases where the Marines were able to build these cages around to avoid people from entering the beaches. People at night started to breaking down the beaches so that more people can come in and do civil disobedience. Um, this was one of the biggest major protests in Puerto Rico. It really like sparked national pride in the people of Puerto Rico, like Vieques, Paz for Vieques and Vieques se respeta. But it wasn't just that it was a problem of Vieques. I mean, this became a problem for all Puerto Ricans. Like we consider Vieques as our national territory, and it definitely was one of the major stepping stones of U.S. imperialism and occupation in Puerto Rico. Next, please. Yeah, so these were the photos that were captured. I was able to capture these photos mostly after celebrating the 20 years. There was a lot of photography that was able to capture in local newspapers. Next, please. This is the soldier, David Sanes, a civilian employed as a security guard by the U.S. Navy. He died from a stray bomb while observing a routine exercise. This was specifically the one that I was mentioning that sparked a huge protest of civil disobedience. As you can see in the left corner, that's his family who were suffering um, the death of this soldier. He was the one who was killed by the misfired bomb. Next, please. Next. This is specifically the cages that were taken down. There were the Marines tried to enforce these cages to prevent people from actually doing civil disobedience, and people actually came to take down the cages so that more people could come. Um, a lot of people supported this event, including people who not only support independence for Puerto Rico. There were people who support different. There were people from from the right, from the left, from the center, and there was at one point that it did like create this national unity of us Boricuas that joined all together to protest against the bombing practices in Vieques. Next. Yes, I remember this was an interesting one. We have the Puerto Rican Independence Party. Rubén Berríos, during his arrest, he was a senator, an elected senator in Puerto Rico, and he specifically spent around 6 months. He survived. He went through storms. He went through multiple arrests. I remember when Rubén actually also had cancer. He had prostate cancer right after leaving Vieques, which was one of the cases that could have like said that because of the uranium, um, he was specifically affected by that, and so were many other people. Next. So on July 29th, 2001, a referendum was held asking the residents of Vieques whether they wanted the Navy to remain on the island, and the victory was leaving overwhelming. It was 68% of the people of Vieques that voted to they did not want the presence of the Marines or any military presence whatsoever in Vieques. Next. Got a movie. So following the Navy's withdrawal, the United States government has undertaken a cleanup process. In that area, that remains incomplete and, according to experts, has been excessively slow and has contributed to the island's contamination. Okay. Due to the use of open field emissions. So yes, and here is basically, I'm mentioning the case of Vieques. I want to point out it's not just a coincidence. It's also the fact that Vieques is one of the examples of how Puerto Rico has always been a colony of the United States since 1898. You also have the case of Vieques was the intent to militarize Puerto Rico in the most cruel way, like practices of bombings. And in 2003, the Marines left Vieques, and this was considered a huge victory for us Puerto Ricans because I remember when there was a lot of talks that, oh, they will never leave. Like, it doesn't matter how much you protest, they will never leave. And I think it was like, it sparked a huge national pride for us because not only did they left, but like we felt like through our civil disobedience, without even lifting one weapon, like we felt powerful in the way that we were able to like kick out the most powerful military in the world. And that's something that speaks a lot for us, right? That, sometimes human dignity and our efforts can beat any weapon. So the Marines came at us with everything. And even when many people were saying that they will never leave, they left in 2003 because of the spark and outrage and the resistance from the Puerto Rican people. And now we find ourselves with a situation where um, the Trump administration wants to impose this war on our Venezuelan brothers and sisters, and they're using Puerto Rico as another military ground for training to enter our territory and use it basically for this war. So this is how this is what, like Jose was saying, this is not just about Venezuela. This is about all Latin America. Like all America Latina is being affected, including Puerto Rico. Like as the United States is pushing for this, Puerto Ricans are also unsafe. The whole Caribbean is unsafe. This is a war on all of us who are Latinos and Latinas. And this is something that we all have to resist, being in solidarity with the Venezuelan people, as also being in solidarity with the demilitarization of Puerto Rico. If we were able to defeat the Marines and we were able to unite, this is the perfect moment to continue to do so because we cannot allow Puerto Rico to once again be remilitarized and be used this cruel way. But I also would have to push that Venezuela has a right to fight for their sovereignty. And we also have to admit that Puerto Rico does not have sovereignty, and that is a major issue, right? As long as Puerto Rico is not free and a sovereign nation, then Latin America is also not really free and sovereign because they can always use Puerto Rico as this scapegoat and as this trampoline to unleash imperialist rule on the rest of the continent. And that is something that we have to keep in forward. So it's important. That's why we were so excited to participate in this discussion. It's important that, the solidarity with our Venezuelan brothers and sisters must also include a solidarity with all Latin America, that the entire people of Latin America must be sovereign and free and exercise their right to self-determination. So thank you. I don't know if Lorna, you have some extra words that you want to mention.
Yeah, that was really beautiful, Edwin. Thank you for saying that. I really feel that sentiment a lot too. Growing up over here, Edwin se crió allá. Edwin was raised in Puerto Rico. I was raised over here in Virginia. Well, I'm in Florida now, but I was raised in Virginia. And just, being a Virginia Rican and about Vieques, like you hear, that was bad. Every Puerto Rican that Vieques, like growing up that it was bad. And just the destruction and but if we could go to the next slide, we'll finish this off and talk about today's political climate. I know we're kind of maybe over time, but this is New York Times came out with this photo last month or the month before showing just the positions of where you can see strategically where everything is right there. I'm a visual person. So, you know, in September, the U.S. Marines started large-scale amphibious maneuvers and disembarked hundreds of troops amid escalating tensions in Venezuela. There's 10,000 U.S. troops, fighter jets, Air Force, Reaper, drones, and various surveillance craft. Next slide. So this is just a list of what's been restarted. It's a really long list going to 2 slides, just showing like there was a naval base that was reactivated, the Roosevelt Roads. And actually, I saw an article recently that said that instead of reopening that, there was actually a proposal for it to be, let me see, a Marine Innovation Center. And so there was a project that was written for the federal government to fund a Marine Innovation Center. And but instead, Trump is, you know, he cut, let me see, there were $365 million for solar and batteries in Puerto Rico that was supposed to be used for that and fossil fuel infrastructure, but Trump cut funds, $20 million for minority programs and climate resilience. But so you see that these could be used for better things. So we have Naval Station, Roosevelt Roads, we have air assets, the bases hosting advanced aircrafts, ground troops, and naval presence. I don't know if you guys saw the videos of all the Marines arriving dramatically on the beach in Puerto Rico. Like, why did they have to arrive in such a, like, you know, dramatic show way, like out of the water? Air Force drones, and then flight restrictions were established until March 2026 on the southeastern part of Puerto Rico. The history of U.S. military bases in Puerto Rico is at its core a history of political interest rather than protection. Next slide. So more than 2 decades after Puerto Ricans successfully united in condemnation of military exercises and bombings on the island of Vieques, raises fears that Puerto Rico could once again become a live fire zone. So it's this trauma that we all carry with us. Even if we weren't living there, we carry this trauma of this could happen, and this is happening. And then spearheading local support of this is the governor, Jennifer Gonzalez. She's consistently proven herself a staunch ally, not merely to corporate American interests, but as a dedicated facilitator of its military colonial apparatus. And approval ratings for JGO, as we call her, are the lowest of any governor. Next slide. So in the recent election, the Independence Party got the most votes ever in history. There was a historic election last year. So the political parties in Puerto Rico are the Progressive New Party, who is the statehood, right-wing statehood party. And that's who's in power right now, Jennifer Gonzalez. In the election, they got 41%. The Status Quo Party is the Popular Democratic Party, the PPD, the Populares, the PPD, who finished 3rd in the election for the first time in the party's history with 21% of the vote. And then we have the El PIP, the Puerto Rican Independence Party, who made an alliance this past election with MVC, Citizens Victory Movement, and which created the historic result of last year. So we see a rise in, you know, young people going out to vote. We see a rise in the independence movement right now. And this is the first time since 1952 that a pro-independence candidate or alliance candidate finished second in a gubernatorial race. It was always like the duopoly, just like here. And so Puerto Rico is kind of, you know, waking up faster than Americans, which, by the way, I would like to say that, oh, and here's photos of the current protests right now. Luma, you know, one of the ways that I like to kind of explain to to my family or people that are not paying attention, like Puertorriqueños that are not really like paying attention and that think that statehood might be a good option, is talking about Luma, the privatization of Luma, right, Edwin? So, you know, talking about Venezuela and Puerto Rico, it's like, you know, look at what Machado, or look what happened with Luma in Puerto Rico and what a mess it is with the privatization of public goods, right? So when you compare that with what Machado is just saying out loud, like what the opposition party wants to do, it's kind of like, you know, it's a comparison that I like to do with, you know, Puerto Ricans or because everybody in Puerto Rico, on all sides of the political aisle are sick of Luma. Edwin, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, I was gonna add to that that's a really good point that Lorna's making, is that Puerto Rico has had like neoliberal governments for quite some time now, for many years. They've tried to privatize many. The last thing was that they privatized the electric grid through these neoliberal policies. And right now, the people of Puerto Rico are having blackouts. That did not used to happen when we had public ownership of the electric grid. It had many problems. They defunded it for no, but workers were unionized. There was a pension system. Now, supposedly there's no money for the pension system anymore. People are paying high rates of bills. Like, for example, my father's in Puerto Rico. I have a home in Puerto Rico. And my father can say, oh, the light bill, my consumption is $50, but I have to pay $150 in fees. Because those fees are being used to pay, we have to now repay the pension system. We have to pay for the repairs. But then at the same time, there are no repairs. Like, you don't see repairs. They're taking a lot of time. Luma is basically like, it used to be 5 companies that were going to compete, and they just said, hey, they just all gang together and create this one monopoly. And it's a American company, right? They have their address in Wall Street. So it's all tied to the privatization, and you know, like, privatizations have been being done for a while now, and it's actually, our economy is actually worse. Our economy continues to be in a recession. Jennifer Gonzalez also, this is also an interesting tie, is that the left in Puerto Rico, even though it's gaining popularity, a lot of the propaganda that the right wing uses in Puerto Rico is to say, no, you cannot vote for the left in Puerto Rico, because if they win, then Puerto Rico will become Venezuela. Then Puerto Rico will become Cuba. You know, that is also part of the imperialist propaganda that is being used, right? Like, all these sanctions, the huge embargo on the Cuban people, and the sanctions and the economic war that is waged, all of that is like pushed aside. And it's like, no, Venezuela is a problem because they're socialist. And if the left wins in Puerto Rico, then we will become Venezuela, right? And the idea is that they're using this tactic as a fear tactic, and they continue using it. And also, it's like, we're not allowed to have coalitions. So that's why we had to form an alliance. It was like informally. Like, we're not allowed to have coalitions. There is no second round of voting. So for example, Jennifer Gonzalez won with 41% of the vote. There is no second round. Like, she just won. A lot of Latin American countries have a second round. You also have the case of the coalitions. A lot of Latin American countries allow coalitions. Venezuela allows coalitions in the elections. And Puerto Rico coalitions are not allowed. So these are the contradictions that you see between the idea that, oh, Puerto Rico belongs to the United States, so Puerto Rico is a democracy, and that is not true. There's a lot of restrictions and a lot of limitations for the same fact that we don't have sovereignty. That already goes against the fact that if we're not really a sovereign nation, then are we really a democracy? That's something that you have to look at. Without no sovereignty, then there really is no real democracy. And yeah, like, these ideas are attached. You see the neoliberalism implemented in Puerto Rico, and you also see the remilitarization of Puerto Rico. And Jennifer Gonzalez, of course, is a huge supporter of Donald Trump. She is a Republican. She is literally a Trumpista, as we say, and she's also a big fan of Netanyahu. And she's a huge supporter of Israel, huge supporter of the Zionist project. So it's like, when people say Maria Corina Machado would be great for Venezuela, And just look at Jennifer Gonzalez, right? She's like the perfect example of a total disaster of neoliberalism. And she was president of the Senate, she was Speaker of the House, and like they fired employees, they have privatized, they have cut down on public education spending, they have closed down schools to say that the cost will go down for education. We still haven't reduced the cost. It really has been 50% of the Puerto Rican people live in poverty. None of this is really helping. And the issue is that when I just simply hear people that Puerto Rico is this paradise, and I'm like, well, you may be visiting for 3 days, but people there like are having like a really hard time. And I just hope that the Independence Party continues to gain traction. I consider myself a member of it. I started organizing back in 2008, 2010, and in the 2012, 2016 elections, and before that, in the early 2000s, the Independence Party and the left only had about 3-4% of the votes. Like Lorna mentioned, it was a duopoly, right? And now in the 2020 elections, we got 15, and in the 2024 elections, the last election, we went to 30%. So in just 2 elections, we gained thousands and thousands of votes, and you can see that in the support of especially young people in Puerto Rico who are waking up. They're realizing that like we are being like conned, and we are a colony, and we're being controlled, and we don't have freedom. And as the duopoly is telling us that we have to be closer to the United States, we have to have this relationship with the United States. Young people especially, are seeing that, well, Puerto Rico belongs to the United States, and I'm having a harder economic time. Like things are actually getting worse under this relationship. Even Bad Bunny supported the left, right? He supported Juan Dalmau for governor. So a lot of people are supporting on the left, saying that it's going to be, Venezuela's going to be a dictatorship, but that's not true. Like the left in Puerto Rico is a strong supporter of democracy, to start because we believe in the sovereignty of Puerto Rico. And that's already the first start to democracy. We believe in coalition. We believe that there could be easier access to building coalitions. We believe in a second round. We believe that Puerto Rican people should actually have the right to, which is one thing that Venezuela did for one point. This is that people can actually participate in building and participating in a referendum, and having a parliament that actually responds to the people. So those are things that we believe in. I don't know how else we can prove ourselves that we believe in democracy, but they're trying to use this propaganda to build that we want to be like this dictatorship. And obviously they wrongfully use Venezuela and Cuba as an example, and that's how it goes on.
So in conclusion, and we have to get to the Q&A. Gracias, Edwin. What you said about Bad Bunny, I just want to say 2 things. The Super Bowl announcement and all of that, with the Democrats and the Republicans arguing about, oh, Puerto Ricans are Americans. We are not Americans.
Right.
Puerto Rican is a nation, its own nation of U.S. citizens. We are right. We're our own nationality. So remember that when you see liberals and Republicans arguing about that, we are Puerto Ricans. And then one more thing, I just wanted to mention that the rise in the independence movement right now. There was an article that came out that the FBI and the Puerto Rico police discussed an independence movement or a group, an organization, as terrorists. So that's happening now, and that's bringing back old trauma from Los Carpeteos, which was mass surveillance on Puerto Ricans. And
COINTELPRO.
¿Cómo?
COINTELPRO, like the COINTELPRO that they used on, the civil rights movement, were also used.
And so that is the end of our presentation, I believe.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. But before y'all wrap up, do you have any plugs for your Puerto Rico working group that you want to make quickly?
Yes, please join us. Please, we're starting to get off the ground, this working group. We need all the help we can get. Join our Signal chat and help us build this working group. We are trying to plan a webinar for before the Super Bowl.
Wonderful. Thank you both very much. Thank you to all our presenters, and thank you very much to our translators this evening who's made this event possible. We're going to have, we went a little bit long. That's okay. We'll probably have a couple questions before we wrap up. I'm going to make sure to paste one more time for everybody how they can get involved with the IC, how they can get involved with the Venezuela Working Group, and how you can learn how to start doing anti-war work in your chapter as it relates to Latin America and Venezuela. So here are those links one more time. The way we will do questions, so if you have a question, send me a direct message with your question, and then I will call on you and I'll unmute you so you can ask your question. All right. Okay. So I'll give people 1 minute. I do have one that I just got, and this will be for Mónica. The question is, so I just want to make sure, I know Jose's been doing a whole lot of work here. Just want to make sure Jose is good to go. So the question is, how have the communes been a part of preparing for national defense in regards to this potential invasion?
¿Sí? ¿Me escuchan? Sí, justamente el día de hoy el presidente Nicolás Maduro firmó una ley que tiene que ver con la defensa integral de la nación. Como es muy reciente, no les puedo dar el dato preciso de cómo se titula, pero sí se está haciendo ese endemiaje tanto legal, porque eso implica recursos, eso implica dotación. ¿Sí? ¿Aló? Es que escuché algo al fondo. Bueno, si hay, por ejemplo, cuando comenzó esta agresión hacia Venezuela, inmediatamente comenzó el alistamiento militar. Nosotros estamos alistados y ha habido entonces formaciones a consejos comunales, o sea, porque es una formación militar, porque tiene que ver con el tema de supervivencia, o sea, estar en un escenario de guerra que jamás nosotros hemos estado. Entonces, sí, lo que sí ha habido son procesos de formación a escala entre las comunidades, por supuesto, en este encuentro Unión Cívico-Militar, por supuesto, el fortalecimiento dentro de las comunas, todo lo que tiene que ver con la integración, desintegración colectiva en grupos de trabajo. Pero justamente el día de hoy se ha institucionalizado porque bueno, eso implica movilidad de recursos para ese fortalecimiento que implica prepararnos para un escenario de esta índole. Aquí ahora es lo que se denomina el alistamiento militar y formaciones por grupos de trabajo, por grupos, por comunas, por tal, que implica lo básico en un escenario, Dentro de las dinámicas de las comunidades es estar activo, estar alerta. Por ejemplo, se ha desmontado varios escenarios de ingresos de personal de la CIA a Venezuela y tiene que ver con las mismas comunidades. Quien lo ha detectado son las comunidades. Es decir, gente extraña que se denuncia. O sea, ¿quién es esta gente que está acá? Entonces, eso tiene que ver con un trabajo de inteligencia desde la comunidad. Entonces, están en doble escala, desde propiamente lo militar, porque ya esto es una escalada que ninguno de nosotros conocemos ni queremos conocer, pero hay que prepararnos ante ese escenario. Y la segunda es cómo es el manejo en las mismas comunidades, que tiene que ver con la información, la inteligencia comunitaria.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So Eric C has a question. So if you, I think, want to direct this one to Jose Luis would probably make the most sense. I will go ahead and allow you to ask your question in just 1 second once I find your name. Okay. Okay, wonderful. Are you able to speak, Eric? Okay, how about now?
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. My question is this. Though it hasn't been reported widely in American mass media, Russia has sent 2 destroyers and has given Trump a very blunt warning to back off on Venezuela. It's also reported from a number of sources that it has provided Venezuela with the S-400 Triumph anti-aircraft system, which is quite effective. Do you think this will serve to deter American aggression?
Sure. I mean, I think the best way to answer that is starting off with the point that, Russia and Venezuela have a very deep, very, very profound relationship, a strategic relationship. In fact, very recently, both countries went through the formal process of approving in their congresses and through the executive, the sort of the elevation of the special relationship and the heightened level of cooperation between the two countries. So of course that's really important, as is the case with China as well. Venezuela and China have what they call an all-weather relationship. And so there's obviously a lot of coordination, a lot of support, mostly commercial. I mean, there's very important investments by Russian state companies in Venezuela's energy infrastructure and things like that. But of course, yeah, I mean, part of that relationship is a relationship that involves the exchange of defensive weaponry. And so what you've seen is I think a product of the result of negotiations that have been happening at a high level between Venezuela and Russia in order to kind of bring more equipment, as precisely as you say, as a deterrent. We should be honest, right? As other people have mentioned, Venezuela doesn't want a conflict with the United States because the United States has a very powerful army, has a very powerful armed forces and navy, as they're clearly trying to demonstrate now. And so, that would be a very difficult situation to handle, to confront. But of course, the Vietnamese defeated U.S. imperialism. Venezuela perfectly can as well, but it would be a very difficult circumstances. And so this mobilization of equipment, the one that you're pointing to, is very much in the mindset of that of a deterrence as well. Namely because, as I mentioned in my presentation, the U.S. wants to find the easiest way possible, right? If they want to avoid a situation, I think, of U.S. troops on the ground. And so, if anything, what we'd probably see in terms of the escalation is strikes on land, which would be carried out by drones or by manned aircraft, which obviously that's where the equipment that you're talking about would play an important role in terms of actually defending Venezuelan airspace. I mean, it's somewhat wild to me that this is where the conversation has to take place now in terms of what are the actual concrete steps that are happening. But absolutely. And it's interesting because there were a number of reports, I believe it was Reuters, but I could be mistaken, who were actually trying to kind of cast doubt over the relationship between Russia and Venezuela, trying to say that, that Russia hadn't actually, been as forthcoming in its support for Venezuela in the face of this U.S. aggression, and that it's hogwash, it's total bullshit. Of course, Russia has actually been quite good. There's been statements regular basis, not just from the spokesperson from the foreign affairs, but also directly from the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. And so, it's something to always keep in mind in terms of the difficult decisions that have to be made when it's this scenario of U.S. aggression directly on Venezuela is very much on the table, and that's why you're seeing these kinds of things. And yeah, absolutely, I think it's good that these things are being published because they do serve as a deterrent, so that they're aware that Venezuela isn't just an easy target, which is kind of the narrative that I think they're also trying to put out there. Similarly with this other piece that came out, I believe it was today, if not yesterday, trying to suggest that there's only a handful of loyal soldiers in Venezuela. This is again information that's likely being filtered through the opposition and their narrative that they're trying to establish.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And then our last question before we go ahead and end this evening. Thank you all thank you very much to our speakers, for especially Mónica, who's 1 hour ahead of us, for sticking on for this long. So our last question, I'm going to go ahead and let Chris ask your question, and then so I will allow you to ask your question. You should be able to come off mute now.
Awesome. All right, thank you. It was a great talk. I just want to say that first. And for Jose and Monica, what is the best way for us in the U.S. to support the Venezuelan people prior to and hopefully not? But if there is an invasion, like how can we support? Like, what would you want from us?
And I just want to confirm, I know whether Mónica is able to hear that. I've had to switch Jose back and forth between the interpretation channels. Mónica, were you able to hear the question? Okay, we'll start with
Bueno,
Jose.
yo lo repito, aquí, Mónica, nos están preguntando qué pueden hacer los estadounidenses justo en este momento y dado el caso de si se llega a dar una agresión directa por parte de Venezuela. Y yo rápidamente respondo la pregunta y te lo paso a ti, ¿no? I think, first of all, thank you for being here. This is part of it. It's about getting ready now in this moment before something worse happens. So you've already taken the first step. And of course, getting involved with an actual organization that's going to be able to, I think above all, what's going to be necessary is a rapid response, is to be able to, as quickly as possible, if there is another aggression, another escalation, to speak out as much as possible and the loudest way possible. And yes, even using the instruments of, you know, the bourgeois democracy of the United States, right? Talking to your representatives, like I mentioned in my speech, that I think there's actually a lot of room here to kind of break apart Trump's own coalition around this. And I think we saw some Republicans break ranks and vote for this war powers resolution. So I actually think there's tons of potential there in terms of actually putting the pressure where it needs to be in order to de-escalate and to stop this aggression. And of course, you know, helping us get this information out to as much as possible, right? If something happens, let's have an emergency meeting, you know, that night, online. You can count on me. I'll do whatever I can to be there if I can be, so that we can be ready and responding to this as quickly as possible. I think the key thing is to respond quickly, because the worst case scenario would be if this gets dragged out, if it becomes, you know, yet another multi-year aggression or occupation in the worst case scenario, which would be really difficult. And obviously that would present different scenarios that we'd have to analyze in the moment. Mónica, adelante.
Sí, bueno, sumado a lo que tú has planteado, José Luis, que es aportar permanentemente a derrumbar la narrativa, porque es que cuando tú entras, es impresionante, la red bloquea todo lo que nosotros realizamos. Algo tan elemental como los canales del presidente de la República los tumbaron. Y así sucesivamente. Entonces, claro, nosotros no hemos parado de trabajar, de tener nuestra vida cotidiana. Y eso es decir, pareciera que yo acá le estuviera cayendo a cuentos, pero realmente es lo que estamos viviendo y lo que ustedes ven en estos dispositivos, que es lo más común para comunicarse, que es esto, la red, plantean otra realidad, que básicamente estamos en una dictadura y que nosotros realmente la estamos pasando muy mal. Entonces, por lo tanto, la acción estadounidense es la más acertada, de la administración estadounidense es la más acertada. Entonces, es un trabajo de hormiga, es un trabajo, porque yo sé que ustedes tampoco la tienen fácil. Sé que más bien ustedes hacen un gran trabajo, pero es un trabajo que es un trabajón para cada uno de ustedes. Y a eso, bueno, como sostenerse es una forma de hacer resistencia. Eso nos ayuda muchísimo para que realmente la verdad de Venezuela salga a flote. Eso es lo primero, el tema de los lobbies que está hablando José Luis, y sostener esta narrativa. Y bueno, y por supuesto coincido totalmente que tenemos que, pase o no pase, que esperemos que realmente no pase, porque realmente nosotros no queremos bajo ningún concepto de verdad vivir ningún tipo de escenario bélico. Igual es importante tener estos espacios de respuesta, canales fluidos, porque de una o lo primero que van a hacer es tumbar el tema de la internet. Entonces, ¿cómo nos comunicamos? Y ahí estamos aislados, ¿sí? Entonces, generar desde ya vasos de comunicación que nos permitan mantener esta comunicación fluida, entendiendo que no suceda que sea solamente una guerra psicológica más que física. Y bueno, y de verdad de corazón, en nosotros está que Puerto Rico sea libre y que esta mismo que ustedes están haciendo con nosotros, de qué manera nosotros establecer estos lazos de solidaridad para sumar a que sean soberanos, porque nada mejor que tener nuestra soberanía, de que podamos dibujar nuestro presente y nuestro futuro, de que de esa potencialidad que somos, creativa, innovadora. Puerto Rico es cuna de la musicalidad y es algo que es nuestro, o sea, que nosotros somos hermanos, pero que sea tan difícil. Un ejemplo, algo así tan detalle como un Gilberto Santa Rosa que tanto lo amamos, no pueda pisar Venezuela porque no se lo permite, ¿no? Porque entonces eso implica que lo anulen en todo lo que es su carrera que con tanto pulso ha hecho, y como él muchísimos. Entonces, también como poder nosotros también de qué manera poder sumar a esta solidaridad, porque la vida sigue. Entonces, bueno, construir ya canales alternativos de comunicación más allá de la red. Todo lo que dijo José Luis, y bueno, mi abrazo solidario, sororo, fraterno, tanto al pueblo puertorriqueño como nosotros que somos el sur global, porque aquí a fin de cuentas, esta hermandad estadounidense, México, Puerto Rico, somos el sur global. Y así seguir juntos, pues. Entonces, bueno, siguen los desafíos, bueno, abrazo gigantesco. Y que la sonrisa, pase lo que pase, sea una permanente entre nosotros, que eso es lo que nos caracteriza como caribeños.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much to all of our speakers. Thank you all very much for sticking. For y'all that are still with us after more than 2 hours. Thank you very much. Join the struggle. Join the anti-imperialist struggle. Join the International Committee. Join the Venezuela Working Group. Join the Puerto Rico Working Group for that matter as well. And thank you very much, Jose, for doing this marathon translation. And so, good night, everybody. I'm very excited about the work we're renewing here, and I hope to see all of you in another meeting in the future.
Buenas noches.
Noche, Mónica. Buenas noches, José Luis. Buenas noches,
Gracias.
Tristan.
Viva Puerto Rico libre.
¡Viva!
Viva. Sí.
Viva Venezuela.
Estoy llorando por lo que dije. Gracias. ¡Mua!
Gracias a ustedes, seguimos en la lucha.
Seguimos.